Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch. We're going to hit our final speaker presentation of the day. It's my pleasure to present Deborah Weissman. She's a professor of law at UNC. If you guys came to the immigration teach-in, she was here last week, and we have her back because we liked her so much. So thank you.
So that was a great win last night. I am obviously talking about the Ninth Circuit. Okay, it is a pleasure to be here this afternoon. In preparation for the talk, I was thinking about how to make sense of the circumstances that we're in, the recent executive orders, particularly the ones that are calling for the wall to be built or extended, because we already have a wall or walls. An upsurge in efforts to deport immigrants, especially Mexican immigrants, who've been depicted as violent and dangerous criminals. What sense do we make of these descriptions and these narratives? And so I thought of what Emiliano Zapata had to say about bandits. He said, and of course he is a leader of the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. He's the inspiration of the current agrarian movement known as Zapatismo. And he led the insurrection against a counter-revolutionary coup that installed a Mexican dictator who was put into power by U.S. business interests. And he stated, "The enemies of the country and of freedom of the people have always been denounced as bandits who sacrifice themselves for the noble causes of the people." So we need to keep in mind to whom and about what and what circumstances are we referring when we talk about the Mexican as criminal. So my talk is going to pull together some related issues pertaining to immigration, the politics of narrative, and how law and narrative are mutually constitutive. And I think these are issues that are really important to us today in ways, given the ways in which immigrants have been cast as dangerous threats to national security and a threat to our neighborhoods and our very homes. The problem of the narrative of the dangerous immigrant, however, does not play out everywhere equally the same. For example, there are some states, as we know, that have sued to reject the Muslim ban. Other states and localities have been committed to developing programs and processes to welcome immigrants into their community. Indeed, there's a whole network of cities called Welcoming Immigrants. Some localities are described as sanctuary cities. But that doesn't describe all of the states and places, and to that end, where immigrants reside has very much to do with what protection of the laws they will receive. So in this talk, I'm going to introduce some particular statutory provisions that are found in the Immigration and Nationality Act as a means to very concretely demonstrate the problem of the political geography of immigrant rights. That is to say, although immigration law is federal law, and although it's to apply to the 50 states and its political subdivisions in a uniform and unified way with an even hand, without distinction, without differentiation, reality diverges from this very fundamental principle. So depending upon where an immigrant happens to live, her legal protections may be vastly reduced. And notwithstanding the immediate crisis regarding the Muslims who are banned from 7 countries, I do want to focus on Latin America in general and Mexicans in particular, as they constitute the largest group of immigrants in the United States. So, the narrative. I want to talk about the current discursive rendition of the Mexican as criminal, most recently refashioned around the politics of the 2016 presidential political campaign and its aftermath. The construction of the Mexican as a menace is not new. It's possessed of a history that has its origins in the 19th century. Mexicans were described as earless and heartless creatures, semi-barbarians, uneducated, grossly ignorant, highly excitable, given to spasmodic outbursts of passion, outlawry, and violence. And the bandito lives on in the hype of the Latino drug runners, the Puerto Ricans tough in New York, and East LA homeboy gangbangers. And most recently in the speeches of politicians, as we have witnessed in the last 18 months. In recent times, it's the Mexican drug war at our doorstep that has really helped to fashion this narrative and really is a narrative that, between fact and fiction, depicts Mexicans as a dangerous and violent threat moving across the border into the United States, a border we are said to no longer have control over. And this discourse has rationalized social and legal policies and practices of exclusion at three levels: the transnational, the national, and the very local level. At the transnational level, Mexican drug cartel crime has been described as a narco-insurgency posing grave dangers to U.S. homeland security. The U.S. Northern Command has called for nothing less than the militarization of the border. U.S. Custom and Border Patrol helicopters hover overhead, while the National Guard has been indefinitely deployed by the thousands, notwithstanding the fact that significantly fewer number of immigrants attempt to cross the border. And this is all before the executive order calling for the building of the wall and the surge of Customs and Border Patrol agents at the border. Much of the border has been transformed from a river to a wall of barbed wire, steel, and concrete. That is, it's a war zone, and residents that live in the shadow of such construction experience fear, intimidation, and hostility. There's a study analyzing a decade of crime data of the 4 U.S.-Mexico border states, including information from 1,600 local law enforcement agencies, as well as federal crime statistics. And the study finds that U.S. border cities are statistically safer on average than other cities in their states and have maintained lower crime rates than the national average. Yet that fact somehow does not fit into the narrative calculus. The erroneous belief that undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than the general population is an important myth to which I will return momentarily. So on the transnational level, the most important legal response to the narrative of drug violence and the Mexican criminal has been what's called the Merida Initiative. And this is a congressionally authorized regional security partnership that has brought about a heightened military response to Mexico's drug war through military means funded and supported by the United States. It has demonstrably increased the violence and resulted in untold numbers of human rights abuses, including rapes, murder, and torture of innocent citizens at the hands of security forces. These concerns have been repeatedly documented by human rights groups in Mexico, international human rights groups, and as well as the U.S. State Department's annual report on human rights in Mexico. So let me stress that my remarks today are not meant to minimize the violence that has cost Mexicans dearly. Rather, the seriousness of the situation requires an analysis of drug-related violence that goes beyond sensationalist descriptions which may chronicle the current turmoil, but really provides very little information about the political and socioeconomic circumstances that give rise to the conditions of the drug war and to the so-called Mexican as criminal narrative that pervades social relationships and legal constructions in the United States. What's been missing from these narratives are the historical and structural determinants of Mexico's drug war, particularly those that implicate U.S. policies as contributing to drug violence. So we never really discuss the facts that set forth the relationship between drug violence in Mexico and the aftermath of the Washington Consensus that required the shrinking of the Mexican state. That tens of thousands of Mexican displaced workers have moved into drug-related activities as a consequence of NAFTA, which displaced collective landholding in Mexico and flooded the Mexican market with U.S. subsidized corn, has no apparent relevance in the discourse. The U.S. trade in guns, that is, guns go south, and the demand for drugs, that is, drugs go north, those are factors that contribute to the drug violence, but once again, these factors do not fit into the narrative calculus. At the national level, it's this distorted narrative that breathes new life into national immigration panic discourse. So there's political fear-mongering about Mexicans. As we know, that has offered a proven method to gain leverage in electoral contests. We know that politicians rely on national security grounds and the moral panic about Mexican invaders, and they have enacted increasingly harsh laws to control immigration and achieve record numbers of deportation. So crimmigration is the new term. Have you all heard of the term crimmigration? Crimmigration is the term that's been coined to reflect the development of a new legal field. It exemplifies the harsh legal immigration restrictions that intersect with criminal law. New federally created categories of criminal behavior have been established with severe immigration consequences, including terminologies such as aggravated felonies, which are offenses that may not be felonies and may involve no violence but increase the numbers of individuals who are scheduled for deportation. There are new categories of immigration crimes and increased penalties attached to those. So the convergence of criminal law and immigration law has not resulted in any additional constitutional protections for immigrants who are caught up in this and subsequently in immigration proceedings. So, for example, appearance of Mexican ancestry is deemed a relevant factor in determining whether reasonable suspicion exists for investigating a violation of immigration law. So Mexicans and all Latina appearing individuals are more likely to be subjected to racial profiling and discriminatory searches and seizures, which then trigger removal procedures, but they have limited Fourth Amendment protections to challenge unlawful practices in immigration court, which is considered a civil proceeding. Thus, they don't have the right to counsel at state expense, notwithstanding the U.S. Supreme Court's own acknowledgement that deportation is the equivalent of banishment or exile. So, if not criminals, the other narrative is that Mexicans are stealing jobs from U.S. citizens. Mexicans are generally not portrayed as high-skilled or inventive workers, as are some other immigrant groups, but they may be hard workers, but they take our job away. So, who knows about quantum physics here? Anybody know about Schrodinger's cat? Yeah. So, Schrodinger's Immigrant is a play on the quantum physics thought project known as Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and he determined some flaw in quantum physics that related to whether a cat could be both alive or dead at the same moment. So Mexican immigrants are either hardworking or lazy at the same moment. At best, they're described as less educated, who are nonetheless provide economic benefits. Their main contribution is the savings they bring to us as consumers in the form of cheaper goods and services. In other words, their low wages and vulnerability, while clearly bad for them, is good for us. Actually, studies by sociologists in the last few years have proven something very different from the narrative of the low-skilled Mexican worker, and that is immigrants who are often categorized as less educated and low-skilled, in fact, have significant technical and other skills and competencies that are highly beneficial to the U.S. workforce. At the local level, the narrative drills deep into neighborhoods, public officials, and law enforcement. Worried citizens, they invoke this fabled imagery of the small-town USA, now subject to ruin and fear because of the influx of Mexicans who are going to undermine the existing social order, local culture, local values. They're viewed as the new social problem. They threaten to overwhelm public education. They're going to exhaust public coffers, endanger health, compromise the very safety of our communities, and drain the system. And they're deemed unwilling to assimilate, as evidenced by their continued use of Spanish language. The rhetoric is vitriolic, and words often imply deeds. One local anti-immigrant group urged its members to come to a rally organized by and for Mexican day laborers and to bring baseball bats, stating, "If we're lucky, we're going to need them." Another proponent of anti-immigration legislation suggested that the problem of illegal immigration could be resolved by, quote, emptying the clip. Minutemen volunteers arrive at designated locations to, quote, hunt Mexicans while wearing T-shirts that read, "Some people are alive simply because it's illegal to kill them." Fear-mongering has taken place particularly in the South, a region which has experienced a significant demographic shift in the last 16 years. Immigrants are disadvantaged by the South's preference for a common culture and a cultural construction of daily life as local concerns mediated through long-term personal relationships tied to place. More Southerners, mostly white Southerners, and individuals from any other region express that they are strongly opposed to living in neighborhoods where Latinos and Latinas are increasingly and visibly a part of the population. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a study some years ago called Under Siege, Life for Low-Income Latinos Living in the South, and found that like African Americans during the height of Jim Crow, Latinas in the South live in constant fear of being unfairly targeted by the police as they go about their daily lives. And so you could see some of the findings. Roadblocks, disproportionate seizing and impounding of vehicles as a result of roadblocks, housing discrimination, and job discrimination. North Carolina has been particularly impacted by changing demographics and really does provide a disturbing case study for examining the convergence of place and anti-immigrant sentiments. One North Carolina sheriff complained about newly arriving Mexicans, and he made brazenly racist comments to the news media, to the News and Observer. He said, Mexicans, their values are different, their morals than what we have. He said, in Mexico, there's nothing wrong with having sex with a 12 or 13-year-old girl. The president of the North Carolina Sheriff's Association said Mexicans were trashy, that they breed like rabbits, and that they rape, rob, and murder American citizens. Again, a comment made by the North Carolina Sheriff's Association president to the media. Another sheriff explicitly ordered his deputies to go get them Mexicans and lock up any damn Mexicans you can during vehicle checkpoints. That came out during litigation. Another deputy sheriff admitted that law enforcement officers in his county targeted Mexicans when making motorist stops and were trained to escalate the situation to justify a search. And a UNC School of Journalism poll some years back confirmed rising anxiety about Latina newcomers with particular resentment on those who had limited English speaking abilities. Approximately 2/3 of the residents indicated an unwillingness to welcome them into their neighborhoods. Hate groups have become active and are brazen in their anti-immigrant rhetoric. In 2009, a group that calls itself NC Fire organized against a county deemed to be too soft on immigration enforcement, solicited groups including the North Carolina Minutemen Patriots, the Minutemen Civil Defense Corps, to be involved in anti-immigrant activity. The North Carolina branch of the Ku Klux Klan stated his belief that the situation in Mexico, the U.S.-Mexico border with people attempting to enter the United States is a, quote, land war. I think we should have our troops there with a shoot-to-kill policy. North Carolina also serves as an example of the tendency of new destination locations in the South, as reflected in legal developments. So let me talk about what's called the 287G program. This is something I thought I could stop talking about because we talked about it a lot about 7-8 years ago when it was first kind of taking hold in North Carolina, and then it seemed to diminish, and it is now back with a vengeance because of the president's executive order on the interior security issues. So there's been a call by Trump to reinvigorate this program. Are any of you familiar with it? So 287G is a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and what it does is it allows the Department of Homeland Security to enter into agreements that give power to local police to enforce civil provisions of the immigration law. It used to be, there were two models. There was what was called the jail model and what was called the task force model. After some period of time with so many complaints about racial profiling, we ended up with the jail model, which kind of limited the ability of local law enforcement to tag immigrants and to send information over to DHS and ICE. But now with President Trump's new executive order, they will go back to the task force model, which means that police and sheriffs will be deputized to enforce immigration law, and their motto is detect, detain, deport. And the last, I'd say, 36 hours have been just an alarming news feed for me in terms of the listservs I'm on about ICE raids and about just an alarming uptick of ICE picking up people through arrests, DWIs, traffic stops, and the like. So, interestingly, or problematically, what counties sign on to 287G? Actually, this slide is a little wrong. It's now 24 of 37 agreements that you can find in the South. So of the 37 agreements nationally, 24 of them are southern states. And we're not even including Arizona in among southern states because it's not part of the South, but you can imagine Arizona has a bunch. At one point, the South had 45 of 70 agreements. North Carolina has the most. North Carolina has 5. And North Carolina was one of 2 states to voluntarily pilot and sign on to, well, not pilot, but to sign on to 287G. So the purpose, according to ICE, is to target and remove violent immigrants who are undocumented, who've been convicted of violent crimes. You could see the list that's from their website. Sexual offenses, narcotic smuggling, human smuggling gangs. But what do we know about who gets caught? So most of the folks who get caught are getting caught for traffic offenses or low-level misdemeanors. This is just a snapshot of some of the data that's been collected by other researchers over a period of time. Alamance County, 70% routine traffic offenses. Gaston County, 83%. Wake County, just this is a 1-month snapshot, 84%. And then in addition to who's getting caught up, who might be of immigrant status, there has been the wrongful deportation of U.S. citizens. Latina appearing individuals getting caught up, not having the wherewithal for a number of complex reasons to assert their citizenship, or trying to but not being respected by the court, and being deported. There have been wrongful assessments of immigration status. So even if you are an immigrant and you're caught up, you may have some valid status or the opportunity to achieve valid status, but there's no chance and no opportunity. So this is just the most basic overview of the kinds of problems with 287G. There's no mechanism to address racial profiling. There's no effective complaint process. And again, many bad actors have signed up for this program. It's not mandatory on counties. It's not mandatory on cities. And so we see the counties that tend to sign up are those who are most likely to harbor xenophobic tendencies and anti-immigrant sentiments. The impact, well, certainly has encouraged racial profiling and stereotyping. It's resulted in the harassment of citizens. It's resulted in the isolation of Latinos and Latinas. People are afraid to fear their homes. This has sort of dissipated over time, and now it's going to get ramped up. Fear of police, fear of reporting crimes. I'll come back to that in a moment. Economic dislocation that affects immigrants and non-immigrants. There was a period of time where people were leaving Alamance County, and it really reduced the tax base and property values because immigrants come in at kind of third-tier property purchases. Again, erroneous immigration determinations and a violation of basic liberties. So Alamance County, UNC law students did a pretty terrific report on what was happening in Alamance County, and the report went over to the Department of Justice, which investigated and found that the sheriff and his deputies were violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They were engaged in discriminatory policing against Latinos, and some data that you can find on the slide. And there were similar studies, including media studies, that found the very same pattern. So a lawsuit was filed, and it finally resulted in a mediated settlement where the sheriff had to undergo anti-bias training and policy implementation. We'll see how that turns out. So a little bit about crime data. This idea that immigrants are coming as bloodthirsty criminals is so belied by the statistics. Just here in North Carolina, there are a couple of studies that replicate all of the national and other state studies that I'm aware of. There was something reported just today. I was trying to pull it up on my phone, but I couldn't find it. The criminal activity by immigrants is lower than that of natural-born citizens. And as the undocumented immigrant population has doubled, violent crime rate has declined by 34%, property crime by 26%. And again, in North Carolina, there are at least 2 studies of population growth and crime that found that counties with the highest Latino-Latina population growth rate have the lowest violent crime and property rates. So one of the most important takeaways from 287G is this. Initiatives like this discourage immigrants from reporting crimes, compromise the public safety, And immigrant crime victims who fear contacting police are going to become more vulnerable to the criminals who target them. So that provides a perfect segue for me to turn to another example of the manifestation of the problem of political geography and immigrant rights. And this has to do with the U visa program. So the U visa is a part of the Immigration Nationality Act. It was created as part of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Prevention Act that then amended the INA. And what it does is it provides legal protection to undocumented immigrants who are victims of crime. And there are two purposes for this statutory amendment. The first is to strengthen the ability of local law enforcement to investigate crimes. If immigrants are fearful of reporting crimes, either as victims or as witnesses, if there's no trust, it breaks down the ability of police to do what they are there to do, which is to protect against community crime. There's another purpose, and that is a humanitarian purpose, and it's to offer protection to immigrant victims who have crimes, and that is in keeping with the humanitarian interests of the United States. So just a little bit on the elements of U visa, because you have to know about that to understand how it plays out in terms of geographic differences. So you have to be a victim of what's called a qualifying crime. And so if you looked at the section of the INA, it enumerates what crimes you have to be a victim of in order to qualify for this remedy. And they're all pretty serious crimes. The applicant has to possess information about the crime. Well, generally speaking, if you are a victim of a crime, you will have information. Sometimes a parent or a guardian can apply as proxy. The applicant was or has to be or will be helpful in the investigation or prosecution of the crime. And that does not mean that it has to result in an arrest, and it does not mean that it has to result in successful prosecution. And that is guidance, which functions as law on the part of the Department of Homeland Security. It does not have to result in arrest, does not have to result in successful prosecution. There's also actually an exception for cooperating or being helpful. So if you're a victim of a crime and if you cooperate, the likelihood that you're going to be harmed by doing so, you may have an exception. And here's the last thing that I put in bold, which is so annoying on slides, but it's the screaming issue about U visas that pertains to geography, and that is you have to get a certificate. You can't just prove that you were helpful. You have to get a certificate, a signed document on an immigration form that says you were helpful. And it has to be by that law enforcement agency that's investigating the crime, or it could be a judge that presides over a case. It could be a judge in a domestic violence matter, for that matter. It doesn't even have to be a criminal case. So what do we know about how the U visa program is playing out? There have been a couple of studies, and there was the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project data. There was an organization called Assista. They did a survey data. There is a spreadsheet of immigration advocates around the country which enter data about their experiences with the U visa. And then the UNC Immigration Human Rights Policy Lab did a 2013 survey. And here's what we found. We found that with regard to U visa policies, they are inconsistent and non-uniform. Remember, this is a federal statute. And that the policies that we find in some locations are completely at variance with the purpose of the U visa. So many certifying agencies refuse to sign. Under any and all circumstances, you could be as cooperative as one could ever want you to be, and here are some of the reasons, and here's where it's happening. Agencies have blanket policies. We don't sign U visas. And where are they located? Mostly in the South. That includes North Carolina. They refuse to sign for reasons completely unrelated to the statutory, regulatory, or agency guidance. Here are some examples of why they won't certify. They don't want to help, quote, illegal immigrants, although that's exactly who the statute is designed to help. It's undocumented immigrants that are the beneficiaries, specific statutory beneficiaries. Durham police refused to sign a certification for a 12-year-old victim of gang rape. And that's because they said it didn't result in an arrest. She couldn't be helpful because she couldn't help them make an arrest, although she did do her best to cooperate. They insinuated that she must have known about the gang because she was Latina and they, quote, all hang out. This was before the current chief of police. Let me just add that. In May, North Carolina, police refused to sign a certification stating that, quote, immigrants in the United States without papers should be sent back to their countries. Okay, what about the statute? Other examples. Gaston County prosecutor refused to sign for a crime victim if the perpetrator was Latino. Duplin County refused to sign on behalf of a 15-year-old forcibly raped, saying, we will never sign a U visa. And although judges are authorized to sign, the North Carolina judiciary issued an opinion that no judge may sign a U visa, and I think we're the only state to have done so. Now, it is true that local law enforcement agencies have discretion as to whether or not an applicant was helpful, but discretion means that you are exercising some judgment, some reasonableness. When you have a blanket policy, you are not exercising discretion. But that's the state of U visas. Just by comparison, again, to just make the point about the political geography of immigrant rights, California has a statewide standard setting uniform standards for all local law enforcement agencies, and the standards are in accordance with the guidance set out by the federal U visa statute. New York is also assisting with uniformity. They're actually expanding the agencies that can certify, and they're encouraging workers who you could kind of squeeze into the U visa in terms of wage theft and other exploitive practices in the workplace. They're trying to expand that so that more and more people could be eligible for U visas. And we also know that agencies, law enforcement agencies that work more closely and more openly with immigrant rights groups were likely to certify in accordance with the statute. So after our report, a Reuters researcher contacted us and did another analysis of national data and found what we had and sort of summed it up saying, chances of obtaining a legal toehold in the United States are largely a matter of geography. In some cities, police and prosecutors readily verify that an undocumented crime victim cooperated, in others, they stonewall. So I think we can see how the narrative of the Mexican as criminal, as it's particularly manifested in these times, in these immediate times, give rise to legal consequences. They play out at the transnational, the national, and the local level. I know this is all sort of negative, bad news. We live in alarming times, but sounding the alarm seems appropriate. I want to remind us, maybe you all don't need reminding, that there are lots of pockets of progressivism, if not entire states, that are rejecting the narrative of the evil immigrant who's unwanted. We can see that in the lawsuits that have been filed against the Muslim ban. Certainly Durham, Chapel Hill, Carrboro, Asheville, Winston-Salem, Greenville, Sanford are examples of towns that we don't get to hear about in terms of what they're trying to do. At UNC, at the Institute for the Study of the Americas, there's this incredibly wonderful, creative, innovative program called Building Integrated Communities, and they work with municipal officials who want to do better by way of immigrants. And so my hope is that we might begin to shift the narrative and legal response. And to that end, I would say that one of the big challenges that we have is HB 318, which is a North Carolina statute that was passed in 2015, that its object is to outlaw or prohibit what are called sanctuary cities. And sanctuary cities is a very vague term, really doesn't have any meaning. Best as I know, there's been no challenge to HB 318. As an issue that's coming up as a matter of national resistance, we can see local communities really rejecting this hate and exclusion. And that local fervor of welcoming and resistance to this, sort of hate-mongering that's happening towards immigrants ought to be met with some legal response. So you may be reading about states who are saying that the threats by Trump to punish cities that engage in sanctuary activity, they'll lose their federal funds. There's lots of very well-developed and sophisticated legal analyses about whether or not that could actually happen. There's 10th Amendment arguments, there's anti-commandeering arguments. We have one level in addition to the 10th Amendment and anti-commandeering issues, and that is HB 318. And for those of you Duke students who may not think that you're going to be in North Carolina for very long. I hope that you'll think about some way to engage in the legal and the community struggle to reject this hate and anti-immigrant sentiment that is belied by facts. The alternative facts about the Mexican as criminal needs to be upended, and I think we all may have a part to play in that. So thank you very much.
Questions, feel free.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you handle, or what is your response when you see writings from the late Justice Scalia in Arizona versus the United States, basically repeating that narrative in the context of an opinion outlining, in that case, the Arizona driving while brown, kind of immigration enforcement? I mean, don't you think that really sort of gives it credibility? I mean, I was shocked when I read that opinion.
Well, yeah, of course. We have to push back, whether it's in a subsequent legal proceeding or whether it's in op-eds or any form we have to challenge those kinds of horrendously uneducated, wrongful, factually wrongful, morally statements. I think we have to think about new claims or refreshing claims. It's very distressing to think about that now, given what we worry about with regard to the Supreme Court composition. But there's other parts of the Arizona decision that are quite lovely, and it's the majority decision. I like to point to the part of the decision where the majority says that discretion in the enforcement or implementation of immigration statutes is so critical because it takes into consideration human beings and their individual circumstances. So even pointing to that as a way of countering, what in that case was the minority voice, I think is important to bring out. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Weissman. Do you think that social media has anything to do with increased this racialism?
I guess it depends. I guess so, because from what I know, and I'm not a student of social media in this vein, I think that we tend to be pretty siloed in terms of who we communicate with in social media, and so there's so much reinforcement of this vitriol and these alternate facts. So it probably does not help. I actually looked at, how did I get there? I was trying to figure out maybe somebody who wanted to be my friend, I didn't know who they were, and all of a sudden I saw on their page, some outrageous stuff, and then linking to who they link to, and yeah, I guess it reinforces. And I know that on the stuff I look at that is, supposedly progressive, a good portion of it is completely unvetted. I wouldn't say nonsense, but it's unvetted, and so it's really important for even those of us who are not in the anti-immigrant pages to be careful of what we're learning. So it probably does. Yeah.
Do you know, you were mentioning some places in North Carolina where they have these, where they're not granting the visas and that kind of thing, and then some places where they're better about it,
Yeah.
right? Do you know if that depends on, the proportion of immigrants in the population, or do you know of any factors people that think that depends on?
I think it happens in places where they view themselves as small-town USA, and all of a sudden there's been what they consider to be an influx and a visible change in the nature of the town. Alamance County is a good example of that. Alamance County actually deliberately solicited immigrant workers in the first, I guess during the last 10 years of the 21st century and into the 1990s. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Because of the need to maintain textile factories and agricultural industries. And it was welcoming because there was such a need for workers, so that all of a sudden families were coming. It wasn't just like a male worker doing the circulatory migration. And the narratives, I'm using this in a different sense, I should say the interviews that we conducted described people really offended by tiendas, bodegas, Mexican flags, advertising a business. They were shocked. And so I'm sorry that I missed Laura's talk, but from what I understand, you know that from your research that communities that are less diverse tend to react. And that's so true of the South. I mean, I don't mean to burden the South, but we are burdened with a particular history. So I think you can see it. But again, Sanford is a place, when I first moved to Sanford, I know that law enforcement there were completely unsympathetic to foreign appearing individuals. And I think that's changed. And I think that's changed because of the way in which this building integrated communities has gone in and tried to figure out at what point can we intersect and provide some services and do some educational programs. How does that work? So I think there's a way to interrupt it or to change it. But to answer your question, I do think it really matters in terms of the history of the place. I'll give you one more example. A current study I'm working on, we've been looking at the data from the Mexican consulate in 3 different jurisdictions. So the Mexican consulate has the Office of Legal Protection, and if you're a Mexican national, you can go to them and seek assistance with law-related matters, and they categorize what it is that people come in for and what they do. And so we're looking at North Carolina consulate, which is in Raleigh and serves North Carolina and South Carolina. We're looking at El Paso, which serves western Texas and southern New Mexico, and then San Francisco, the consulate in San Francisco, which serves, the counties around San Francisco and the state of Hawaii. And what we found is that the type of legal assistance that the consulate can give is very much interrelated with the background of state laws, state culture, local ordinances, the degree to which there are NGOs there that are supportive of immigrants. So you can imagine if you're an immigrant in San Francisco, you're in good luck compared to if you're an immigrant in North Carolina, where the local culture, I mean, you can't use a matricular card, you can't drive. In San Francisco, not only are there state laws that are so protective and prophylactic against discrimination, but the city itself and the county have all of these protective ordinances. It is illegal for an employer or for anybody to use the threat of outing somebody for their immigration status to gain any kind of benefit So it's very much the history of the place and the laws of the place, the culture of the place, all of which kind of go together. Yeah.
Is the 287G program available only to sheriffs, county sheriffs, or can it be a police department or other agency as well?
It can be local police and county sheriffs.
And then you mentioned a number, but it struck me as a relatively low number of agencies that have entered into the agreements, considering the large number of sheriffs and counties that we have.
Yeah.
So what is the number? It's like in the
Yeah.
digits?
So under Bush, there was a real strong concerted effort on the part of ICE to get counties to be involved. So there were up to 72. But most, I don't know about most, there's been a real pushback by law enforcement agencies themselves to say, we're really not in the business of immigration enforcement. Sometimes it's from a very utilitarian perspective. We don't have the resources. This is going to break us. But often it's because they do understand that it interferes with their particular mission of community policing and community safety. The International Association of Chiefs of Police have come out strongly against 287G. They've denounced it. They've said not only does it wreak havoc with the priorities of local law enforcement, but that it does contribute to racial profiling and does contribute to illegal practices. So there were more, and the number of counties said this is not working for us, either because it was burdensome economically or because they understood that the relationships between community and police was really fracturing. it's not at the end of the day good police practice.
Just reflecting on geography and discretion again, I know from just my dipping my feet in research, I know that there are pockets where the immigration courts have just high denial rates. For example, Atlanta or Miami, and obviously there's, and yes, here. So I know that obviously we've identified there's data on the fact that judges in these different immigration courts do deny more applications. What can be done about this judicial discretion?
Such a great question. So last April, one of my former students, who's now a kick-ass immigration attorney, represented the student from Durham High School. I can't remember the high school, saved the day along with Butterfield. She came to me and she said that the immigration courts, judges in the Charlotte courts were refusing to follow Fourth Circuit law and bullying attorneys and actually denying individuals who are unrepresented the right to even present an asylum claim. So if you're before a judge and you say, I'm afraid of returning, that's it. They're supposed to hand you an I-589 form, and of course it's not going to do much good. It's in English, you don't have an attorney, but at least they're supposed to do that. There's also Fourth Circuit law that's pretty gosh darn good on some of the asylum issues that crop up for women and children seeking asylum from Central America. And those are the cases that the immigration judges in Charlotte are most hostile to. So what we thought we would do, and I'm really glad you raised this because I think that there's such an incredible need for Duke law students to get involved, and you can get involved, and you will get involved. We decided we would do a training for immigration attorneys who take these cases pro bono, because what we want to do is to tell people you need to prepare these cases so that you make a record. We need you to know how to try these cases so that you make a record so that they can be appealed. First, they get appealed to the Board of Immigration Appeals and then to federal court. It goes directly to federal circuit court. We need you to make a record. And then we need some of you to figure out how to do federal appellate litigation. And if you can't do that, there are some big pro bono firms that'll help. So that was the plan. We had a full day training. It was the Friday after election. The training started at 8:30 in the morning. A room this big was filled with attorneys, with students. People from School of Social Work came because they can really provide some very good counseling about how do you represent a kid. You know, kids don't show up for their appointments. They don't get it. You know, they're traumatized. How do you represent somebody who's been traumatized? There are people from public health there. What we decided to do is to create, right now, a UNC campus-wide, not just law school, asylum network. And we're working together with the Institute for the Study of the Americas. We had our first little mini training. We had the librarian from UNC who is in charge of Spanish language acquisition materials. She showed us research tricks that nobody knew, and there were some really good researchers in the room to help with asylum claims. We are going to try to use undergraduates because they can do some country condition research. We need interpreters. We need translators. We need to work with faculty to be willing to be experts in these cases. And so that's the game plan. It's going to have to start out, you know, we have to build it, but we are going to build it. I have been in touch with Ann Gordon here and Andrew Foster, and I'm going to be talking to Ann in 2 weeks about how to involve Duke students, because there's a lot of work to be done, and you all, you know, have great intellectual insight and research skills and hopefully some language skills. And the other thing about building a network along these lines is, in addition just to really building capacity for immigration representation, it's a political statement. It really is. So I hate to use the word brand, but we want to like brand this project, you know, and for it to be a UNC Duke kind of collaborative would be tremendous. So that's the plan. And, you know, things don't happen overnight, but I'm really pleased to know that from November, we just didn't say, okay, you were trained, you know, now go at it. We're really trying to figure out the next steps and a series of steps to make it happen. And again, involving Duke law as well.
So I'm unfamiliar with how immigration courts are funded, but I know there's this huge backlog. Are they at the mercy of receiving less funding during this administration and creating a bigger backlog, or are they protected against that?
I don't know. I know that they have reduced the number of immigration judges in the past, and I wanted to go back to something that you said about the statistics, just so people here know. Atlanta has the lowest statistics. Atlanta used to be our immigration court. Now we have our own court. We thought that would be a good thing. Oh, hell no. And there are studies. There are the EOIR studies, out of the Department of Justice own statistics show the grant rate. There was a study done, so Syracuse University, I forget what it stands for, TRAC. I don't know if anybody ever uses their data. They collect the most unbelievable data. They show that. And then there was a study done by some scholars out of Georgetown, I believe, that looked at a number of cases. And just to make the point, they looked at and found that individuals almost identically situated, same gender, same age, same country, same town, same sort of statutory factors that get you asylum, and where they lived, different outcome. Yeah.
So I was wondering, over the past election and now, we've been hearing a lot of language surrounding immigration policy about undocumented immigrants versus documented immigrants, and how the two distinct groups are treated. And some of the examples you showed have that kind of language. And so I was wondering how that plays into this Mexican criminal narrative, and if there is a documented Mexican immigrant, does that even make a difference?
It really doesn't. I mean, the narrative of the Mexican as criminal really does not distinguish between status. It's just a terrible stereotype that has long-standing cultural roots in the United States. So I don't think it does. Yeah, does that answer your question? I mean, again, if you just think about Mexican workers who have employment visas. What I said about new studies showing that people who are categorized and come in on visas for the lowest level of employment visa, the unskilled worker, you talk to any contractor who runs a construction site, and they will tell you that immigrant workers from Mexico have what they call sort of horizontal set of skills, where U.S. workers have vertical skills. A U.S. worker is trained to mix the cement. Another one, I know I'm exaggerating, another one lay the brick. Mexican workers know the whole job. And because they know the whole job, at least the contractors and the foremen on the job are saying that they skill up. They skill up. They bring the level of, work up. Someone else had a question. Yeah.
Do you think that sort of this narrative of Mexican immigrants being economic competition plays into the narrative of them being criminal, or are they just separate sort of narratives as to why they would be undesirable?
I think that it's hard to separate them out, but certainly the narrative of them stealing our jobs is very present, particularly, and I bet you would know this better, particularly in some of the Rust Belt places and perhaps even in the South. I mean, of course now, the big agricultural camps are worried about what's going to happen with the reduction of, and every now and then you hear about when there's a real crackdown, tomatoes rotting in the field, but I do think it's both. And they just all sort of come together that this is an undesirable person. But what really drives this, I think, is the hype that is used as political leverage, that this is a dangerous force. I mean, I read newspaper accounts after newspaper account, and the Los Angeles Times had this horrendous series, the drug war at our doorstep, and all these grisly accounts. Yes, there are grisly, horrible murders. I worked on a project on the femicides in Ciudad Juarez. Horrible stuff. But you can't just say horrible stuff is happening. Why is it happening? Look at what NAFTA did. There were the level of criminal activity in Ciudad Juarez before NAFTA was the same as any place in the United States, any similar situated city, population-wise, probably lower. And it was after NAFTA when all these maquilas were just drawn to the border, and they deliberately, if you look at the trade magazines, they deliberately asked for female workers, believing that women would be docile and they could do this handiwork. And of course, it turned out to be that women were, as interested in organizing and fighting for their rights as anybody. And then they decide, well, maybe we should hire men because they're the primary breadwinners and they surely can't afford to lose their jobs. However which way it went, there was a draw of workers from the south of Mexico because they lost their ability to compete in the agricultural market because we subsidized corn. Mexicans couldn't send subsidized corn to us. And so there was no infrastructure. The profit that's made in the maquilas is north of the border. They can't tax anything south of the border. So you have this horrendous infrastructure, it was the unraveling of the social fabric of Ciudad Juarez. You know, it's no wonder people went wild. And I don't mean to say went wild. That's not a very accurate description of what happened. But the social fabric breaks down. So you just don't say, oh, my God, there's all these murders. Why? Do we pay attention to the fact that drugs go north? Do we pay attention to the fact that the guns that have been confiscated in the hands of the cartels are usually identified as guns that were purchased or illegally smuggled into Mexico from the United States? There was a point in time when, I think it was Ciudad Juarez, wanted to ban more than one gun per household. And I can't remember which gun manufacturer threatened to bring a claim under NAFTA that it was in violation of the NAFTA to regulate the number of guns you can have in your house. Did someone else have their hand up?